Hi there, I'm Jake. Welcome to the Blind Eternities Tavern. Now, stop me if you've heard this one before. You go and check out a new LGS because they have a Commander Night scheduled, and you sit down at a table with 3 people you've never played with before. You have that pre-game discussion about what your decks generally do and how powerful they are, and you decide that everyone's right around that high 3, low 4 range. Nobody's running more than a handful of game changers, so you figure it's going to be okay. But then on turn 1, first player plays a fetch land into a dual land into an Esper Sentinel, and second player plays a Coom Refuge into play tapped. You know you're off to a rough start, and you're probably going to have a pretty mismatched game. Today I want to talk about a few cards that we can include in our deck to help balance the scales, for when you're playing at those tables that are a little bit mismatched in power level. Today I want to talk about cards that are really good against high power and really bad against low power. Today we're talking about cards that punch up. So pull up a chair and have a seat at the table, and whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash, or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful riffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake, let's talk games. Every Friday night, my LGS hosts a Commander Night. It's a ton of fun and a lot of people show up. Lost Levels, they're awesome, check them out. But because there's so many people, there is a wide variety of power levels. Everything from basic straight out of the box precons through fully tuned CEDH. Most of the time this works out pretty well, and most people bring a variety of decks to play at those different levels. But occasionally, there's a bit of a mismatch. And when you have some of these high bracket 2s against low bracket 4s, there can be a significant difference in power. So my goal with the most recent deck that I've put together is to bridge that gap a little bit. And the deck that I've chosen is Shadow the Hedgehog. Now, originally seeing this card, I thought it would be really fun to build a combo Rakdos CEDH deck, but I just don't really think this card fits as well as I initially did. So instead, I'm tuning this to be a bit of a high bracket 3, control-y, mid-range type deck that cares about both halves of the card, gaining value off haste creatures and cards with flash, as well as casting things uncounterably with split second. So this deck is uniquely positioned in a way that it can force answers through some of these high-powered decks. And because of that, I want to build this deck as a bit of a police deck. A way to control the table, and a way to balance some of these extremely high-powered strategies with some of these more basic, low-powered, straight-out-of-the-box precon strategies. So let's talk about a few individual card choices and why we are including them in this deck to play against this mixed field. So when I talk about high-power strategies or high-powered decks, I mean actions that we can take as players that break the structural rules of Magic. And when I say structural rules, I mean the hard limits put on things in the game, because unlike a lot of other card games, Magic isn't super prescriptive with what you can do on a turn. There's only 4 limitations. You untap 1 time, you draw 1 card, you play 1 land, and you attack 1 time. Any card that allows you to do these things multiple times, or simulate those things multiple times in a turn, gets you very far ahead of your opponents, especially if it does it passively. This is things like Rhystic Study, Necropotence, Mox Opal, Mox Diamond, anything that allows you to get extra mana, extra draws, extra attacks, or extra untaps is going to be incredibly powerful. And so if we're trying to build a deck that balances these aspects, we want something that limits people's ability to have access to these parts of the game multiple times for free. And I think that one of the big balancing factors in Magic is that everything costs mana. So as the game goes on, we can do more and more powerful things. And it's cool to do powerful stuff. We don't want to build a deck that limits people's ability to do the things that their decks want to do. We just want to make sure that they do it fairly, that they pay what they're supposed to. So in my Shadow deck, I've leaned into this a little bit, and we're running a handful of cards that make sure people pay what the cards are worth. The first card is Trinisphere. And I know a lot of people will bristle at running stacks pieces, but hey, it's not a game changer, right? But the reality is, Trinisphere does a very good job of shutting down some of these really high-powered lines. Underworld Breach becomes a lot less optimal with a Trinisphere in play. A lot of these crazy cards that you can run that are free, that interact with the game state, get locked out pretty well by Trinisphere. And by using Shadow as our commander, we can ensure that this resolves. The coolest thing about Trinisphere to me is that a lot of the low power decks don't care about this at all. Most of their cards are already 3 mana, and if they're trying to do big stuff, Trinisphere doesn't exist. It only shuts down crazy strategies. But there's another card that only shuts down crazy strategies, and that's Vexing Bauble. I really like this card. It just prevents people casting things for free. And obviously this catches a few other cards up in it. Cascade becomes a lot less appealing because it doesn't do the thing you want it to do. And there's other cards that just don't work super well with the Vexing Bauble in play. But the coolest thing about this card is that it has cycling too. I mean, not really. But if you don't need it, you can always ditch it and draw a card. So if you're playing at a table where this is irrelevant, you can just pass it along. And I think that's one of the most important things about these type of pieces, because one of the worst feelings in the world is running a stacks piece that locks yourself down as well as your opponents, or just drags the entire game down, or has no effect at all. And Vexing Bauble allows you to ditch it. The third card that I'm running in Shadow that acts as something of a balancing effect is Blood Moon. And I know that this has become less effectual as the game has gone on and as people have better access to non-basic lands, but I do really enjoy the aspect of Magic being a game constrained around colors. And Blood Moon gives you that ability. Blood Moon puts you in a position where you have to make hard choices about the colors that you have access to and the types of mana that your lands can tap for. In a Shadow deck, these cards become uncounterable and allow you to set up the table in a way that really slows the game down. Gives some of these slower, more simple decks a better opportunity to do the things that they want to do, while taking some of these higher powered, more aggressive decks and just putting a little bit of extra weight on them. But ultimately, that's just one deck and one strategy. I'm not going to go through all the cards in this list, and it is still very much in flux. But let's take a step away from this particular deck and this particular strategy and talk about a few other cards that have an amazing ability to hamper some of these high-powered decks without really affecting some of these low-power decks. So now let's get into some of these specific answers. I want to talk about specific cards that solve specific problems. And there's a few individual problems that I'm going to look at, but you might have your own problems. Whatever your high power strategies are that you are having to contend with in your local meta, you should tailor your deck to do those things. I think one of the big pitfalls that people run into with stacks pieces and some of these more controlling, policey type cards is that they run things just cause. They run Blood Moon because they've heard it's a good card to include when you're dealing with high-powered stuff, and it's not actually going to stop every deck. And frequently, it'll stop you. So building your deck around these pieces, building your deck to accommodate the control pieces that you are including, helps the game keep moving. Your goal is to drag the high-powered players down, not drag everyone down together. So as we walk through these cards, please keep that in mind and understand that these are not one-size-fits-all solutions. But the first problem that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to call a bunch of stuff. And how do we stop a bunch of stuff? With cards like Rule of Law. Now, this is just kind of an archetype of cards that all limit the number of things your opponents can do in a turn. Rule of Law is each player can only cast one spell each turn. It's a color-shifted version of Arcane Laboratory, and there's a variety of cards that perform similar to this, if not exactly. Now, the cool thing about Rule of Law is that this is actually part of a number of different combos. I run this one in my Rebel deck, and it's really good for a deck with a lot of activated abilities in play. I can continue to pull more creatures out of my deck and continue to build my board, while all of my opponents are stuck on one thing each turn. The cool thing about Rule of Law effects is it doesn't really hamper some of these decks that have a really high mana curve. These lower powered decks that are paying 6 mana for rampaging Baliths aren't going to blink an eye at Rule of Law, but some of these other decks that are trying to storm out with a lot of things in one turn are going to be completely locked out of the game. So Rule of Law effects can really help to balance the scales in certain environments. But what if the problem isn't a lot of stuff? It's a lot of rocks. What if people are just aggressively ramping and getting ahead of the table and being very greedy with the way that they are playing their cards? Fortunately, there is a lot of answers to this, and they vary color by color, but there is one in every single color of the game. So now let's look at a bunch of rocks, and how do we solve that? Aside from just destroying it, because that's boring, there's a lot of ways of clearing the board, but we don't want to just run Obliterate in every one of our decks. It makes the games a lot less fun, and there's no real safe way to play that into a board of high-powered players and low-powered players. So let's start again with white. First up, we have Blind Obedience. This makes all of those rocks come into play tapped. It limits what our opponents can do on a turn-to-turn basis, and usually Blind Obedience allows you to get ahead while your opponents are stuck treading water. Over the course of a game, Blind Obedience stops people from running away with the game without actually stopping the main strategies of those decks. Getting treasure tokens into play tapped is significantly worse than getting treasure tokens into play untapped, but it doesn't completely remove them from the game. This is a stacks piece that I think is fairly balanced and works really well at every level of play. Lower powered decks that are just putting big dudes into play don't care if they come into play tapped if they don't have haste, and if you're playing a mana rock, chances are you're trying to use it to ramp rather than doing more and more things in a turn. I really like Blind Obedience, plus the Extort Rider is occasionally relevant and is a nice little outlet for infinite mana and infinite casts if you have the opportunity to do that. But let's move on from white and check out a blue card that solves a bunch of rocks. And my preferred blue card for this is Energy Flux. Now this card is very punishing, and I think in some tables will get a lot of dirty looks. But this causes every artifact in play to now cost 2 every turn or be sacrificed. This is a really cool card to manage some of these high-powered decks, especially with Smothering Tithe, because putting all those treasure tokens into play is now a liability. And the fact that this is an enchantment means that you can keep this card around without paying anything. Now there's a couple sister cards to this that affect other creature types, or other card types, creatures, enchantments, and otherwise, that have similar effects, and those are very good, but this is the one I think that I run most often. Managing artifacts is really critical at this mixed power level type dynamic. Now this card I pulled out of a mono blue control deck, and it does a really good job there because I just want to play land go. It's very classic mono blue, and it doesn't run a lot of artifacts, so this does a pretty good job of balancing those tables. The next 2 cards I actually run together, but both of these are a solution to a lot of artifacts in play, and that is Meltdown and Titania's Song. Now, Titania's Song is a special card to me. I think it solves a lot of problems and can lead to very funny board states. It takes every artifact in play and turns it into a creature with power and toughness equal to its mana cost. So all of those mana rocks that you played, they are just bears. And all those treasure tokens that you just got, they're gone. They become 0/0s and immediately die. The cool thing about this one, again, it's an enchantment, so it sits in play. And I do think people aren't running enough enchantment removal. But both of these cards do a really good job of taking care of some of these low mana cost enchantments that tend to be, or low mana cost artifacts that tend to be the biggest problems. So by feeding a few mana into Meltdown or by getting one of these Titania's Songs into play, you really lock down the table for those heavy artifact decks. Now, in black, there's not really a good solution to a lot of artifacts in play or a way to deal with some of these mana rocks. You can go the other direction and use black to target some of the lands and remove those, but I think realistically, if you are having a problem with mana rocks or with those artifacts in play, you're going to have to rely on some of those other colors, just because black is so light on it. You can go to some of the artifact answers like Null Rod or Kill Switch, but usually those aren't even good enough in a full game of Commander. So without getting into that really heavy stacks, I think there's other things that you'd want to capitalize on. The coolest thing about building decks in this way, with focus on specific high-powered strategies, is you can interweave these with your own strategies for winning the game. Titania's Song actually does really well if you're also running a bunch of high mana cost artifacts. All of a sudden, that Spine of Ishsaw that you played is a 7/7 that can beat down your opponents. And there's a lot of other things that you can do by powering out mana rocks and other draw power. With Trinisphere and Vexing Bauble, you can get on the offensive playing only control cards. And similarly, if you're running things like Blind Obedience or Rule of Law, these are part of combos that you can use to cast infinite spells while extorting, or cast a card like Knowledge Pool that stops your opponents from ever casting a spell again. It's one of the main win conditions in my Rebel deck, and while it's not fun to lose to, it means that these cards aren't just dead in the deck that I'm playing them in. The other thing you'll note is I'm not playing all of these cards together. They come from different decks, they solve specific problems, and they allow me to manage specific weaknesses that my deck has with what my opponent is doing. But there's one color you might notice that I've left out of this, and that's because black doesn't have a lot of answers for opponents doing things. You have cards like Underworld Dreams that punish draw, and things like Orcish Bowmasters, which limit your opponent's ability to draw a bunch of cards in a turn, but for the most part, if you're playing mono black, your goal is going to be to manage the board in other ways. Creatures, lands, cards in hand, and life points. I think black is the truest color for the best removal is player removal. If you're trying to manage high-powered players, you can punish them by giving them a limited lifespan. Just target that one player when they start getting ahead. And that's going to be your best bet for keeping the table even. In closing, I think there's a lot of different cards that impact the board in different ways, and by choosing specific cards that work well with your strategy or work specifically against your opponent's strategy, you can police the board in a way that makes the game more interactive and more fun. Cards like Root Maze can really shut down players that are running too many fetch lands, or do a lot of wacky things with the abilities on their lands. Cards like Rest in Peace can completely lock out graveyard decks while being completely irrelevant to everyone else at the table. There's a lot of cards like Stranglehold that limit your opponent's ability to search their library. You don't have to go full opposition agent. Something simple like Stranglehold or even Mind Sensor is usually enough. And in addition to that, Stranglehold limits extra turns. There's all sorts of unique effects in Magic, and I would encourage you, if you are having a problem with specific high-powered strategies that tend to take over the game, finding those cards that work in your deck. I know a lot of people shy away from stacks pieces and shy away from mass land destruction, but I think there's a lot of cards that are somewhat adjacent to those effects that are absolutely critical to have fun play. One of my favorite cards in Magic is Natural Balance. It's a 4-mana cost sorcery that forces everyone to have exactly 5 lands. If you have fewer, you can search for up to that many basic lands and put them into play to get you to 5, and if you have more, you have to sacrifice until you have exactly 5. It punishes ramping players while giving a bit of a benefit to that player that didn't draw their 3rd land. It's a fun way to just bring everyone together onto the same equal playing field. And I think it's really cool, if you're not playing for any specific prize, to make sure that you're having fair games of Magic. And I'm saying that unironically. I think a lot of these stacks pieces actually lead to fair games of Magic. The issue is if you're using stacks pieces to eliminate the game aspect of Magic. So be careful in the way that you apply them, but don't be afraid to include the specific pieces that work in your specific situation. It's been nice talking to you.